a bedtime biography of Cleobulus of Lindos, one of the legendary seven sages of ancient Greece, is what the guardian of the Plateau invites you to immerse yourself in right now. If a man managed to hold power for 40 years over an island full of schemers and still became known as the greatest thinker of his era, then his mind held great secrets. He combined devastating physical strength with the grace of a hungry lion. While his army took the lands of Lycia, he cut aqueduct systems through solid rock that still work today, 2,500 years later. This tyrant, engineer, and poet hid dangerous truths in the packaging of riddles and believed that only the golden measure saves a man from the madness of power. Take a deep breath and let the hustle of the day dissolve. We begin our journey to the sources of ancient wisdom. Only ignorant people still imagine Greek philosophers as emaciated old men with pale faces who feed exclusively on roots and something like lentil soup. Those experienced gentlemen who have already strolled through Plato of Plato, that is, fallen asleep to the stories on our channel, know perfectly well how strong and physically developed the thinkers of antiquity were. Take Socrates, for example, who was not merely a street arguer but a formidable hoplite, a heavy infantryman who went through 3 grueling military campaigns in iron armor and with a heavy shield in his hands. Or look at Empedocles, who combined the talents of a prophet and a dazzling handsome man, gathering crowds of admirers with his mere appearance in public. In Hellas of the 6th century before Christ, the system of elite education for youths was built in gymnasiums, where Latin and geometry were taught in intervals between brutal wrestling matches. Gymnastics and the formation of an athletic body were as mandatory a part of the curriculum as rhetoric. The Greeks sincerely believed that it was foolish to develop the brain if it was housed in a flabby and feeble shell incapable of bearing the weight of a good bronze sword. Cleobulus of Lindos occupied one of the most honorable places in this athletic company of philosophers. His contemporaries and subsequent biographers unanimously agreed that this ruler possessed crushing physical strength and outstanding external data. The main written evidence of this fact for us are the works of Diogenes Laertius, who refers to fragments of letters and oral traditions of Rhodes that have come down to him. Later, Plutarch, in his Parallel Lives, also noted that the ruler of Lindos governed the island not only by force of his authority, but also by an imposing physical presence, which affected the unruly subjects no worse than a detachment of mercenaries. Mark Twain once remarked that a kind word and a hefty revolver always work better than just a kind word. In the 6th century before Christ, revolvers had not yet been invented, but Cleobulus found an excellent substitute for this rule in the form of his own broad shoulders and a reputation as a first-class wrestler. When a ruler with the status of a sage advises you to observe moderation and not to plunder merchant ships, it is perceived as a sensible lecture on economics. But when the same advice comes from an athlete capable of single-handedly knocking a raging bull off his feet, that advice instantly acquires the status of an immutable state law. Cleobulus proved to his century that true wisdom becomes much more attractive if it is backed by excellent posture and the ability to break an enemy's spine in close combat. His impeccable manners were combined with the ease of movement of a professional military man, and his physical power made the most violent troublemakers of Rhodes behave quietly and decently during popular assemblies. But all in good order. You know, if in the 6th century before Christ someone had decided to compile a guide to the best places to start an outstanding life, the city of Lindos would have taken one of the first lines in this list. Around the year 630 before Christ, a boy was born into the family of a respected citizen named Evagorus, Cleobulus, the son of Evagorus. His father, apparently, was a gentleman of firm principles and very solid means, for in archaic Greece, raising a philosopher who could not only reason about lofty matters but also, on occasion, keep his neighbors in check, cost a considerable amount of money. Here an inevitable question arises, which perceptive people of our time often ask. How do we even know the details about a man whose first breath vanished into the air long before the appearance of the chronicles we are accustomed to? Our main guide to this world became Diogenes Laertius, an outstanding ancient biographer who, centuries later, gathered bit by bit the surviving evidence, decrees, and oral traditions. It is thanks to his work that the names of Cleobulus' parents and fragments of his letters have come down to us. The historian Duris, to whom Diogenes refers, adds a curious detail. Cleobulus had Carian roots. That is, he may not have been a pure Greek, which only emphasizes the cosmopolitan character of Lindos, a port city where peoples mixed. Clement of Alexandria and Plutarch also contributed to preserving this story. They argued about his status, studied his laws, and carefully passed down his sayings to posterity. Lindos was not a quiet backwater for wandering minds. It was founded by Dorians in the 10th century before Christ and was among the 3 oldest cities of Rhodes, along with Ialissos and Camiros. Centuries later, in the year 408, these 3 cities jointly founded Rhodes, the new capital of the island. But long before that, Lindos was already thundering throughout the Oikoumene. The island was famous for its unparalleled seafarers, whose maritime law would later form the basis of the laws of many states, as well as its fierce slingers, capable of putting out the eye of an enemy soldier from a good 100 paces. And it was Cleobulus, the tyrant, the sage, and the builder, who was honored to lead Lindos in its golden age. In such a place, the air was saturated not so much with abstract poetry as with the smell of Egyptian wheat, Cypriot copper, and the salty diligence of port terminals. Lindos was the sea gate into the Aegean from Cyprus and the Levant, a natural meeting place for Greek and Phoenician seafarers. The city actively participated in the Great Greek colonization. It was from here that the founders of Gela in Sicily set off. To be born here meant from childhood to understand how the gears of world trade turn. The boy quickly learned to appreciate good ship timber, strong rope, and precise words. But he also had to learn to balance in this human ocean, where every second person tried to cheat you, and every first person carried a short sword. Time would pass, and the name of Cleobulus would be inscribed in golden letters in the list of the 7 sages of the ancient world. Getting into this elite club of antiquity was more difficult than a modern politician receiving a Nobel Prize, for the Greeks valued a man not by the volume of books he wrote, but by his ability to stop a war with one sharp phrase or save a state from ruin. Only people of action, statesmen, legislators, and rulers who could bring order to both their own home and the minds of their fellow citizens made it onto this list. The society of that time itself selected the ideas and aphorisms of the best, passing them from mouth to mouth until this recognition became absolute and undeniable. On our channel, there is a whole playlist dedicated to the 7 sages of Greece, where you can learn in detail how they influenced the history of both the ancient and modern worlds. Take a deep breath, close your eyes, and let the guardian lead you further. Let us explore the family and genealogical tree of our hero. Here, the harsh reality of Carian mercenaries and the dazzling myth of the greatest hero of Hellas collide. In the archaic world, Origin determined a man fate long before he came of age. If molten gold of demigods flowed in your veins, society expected from you not banal trade deals, but great deeds, great words, and great victories. When a boy from a good ancient Greek family grew up, respectable society inevitably not only began to scrutinize him to form an opinion of the youth, but also compared him with his ancestors. If you asked the stern skeptics among Cleobulus' contemporaries or leafed through the surviving works of the historian Duris, the Carian roots of the future ruler of Lindos would inevitably surface. The Carians in that distant era were extremely tough fellows, known throughout the Mediterranean as first-class mercenaries, fearless pirates, and builders of impregnable tombs. They were ready to sell their heavy shield and sharp sword to anyone who paid well. And believe me, having such ancestors was damn useful for a street fight in the port alleys of Rhodes. But admit it, Carian roots, whatever practical advantages they possessed, sound not too poetic for a man who planned to claim absolute spiritual and political power. Korea for the refined Hellenes of the 6th century before Christ remained a semi-barbarian land from which stern warriors were brought, but by no means refined thinkers. That is why people much more willingly whispered about a completely different side of his origin. From mouth to mouth, a legend was passed down that Cleobulus traced his direct and unbroken lineage to Heracles himself. This was, in modern terms, an absolutely brilliant public relations move of that time. In ancient Greece, to say that your great-grandfather strangled Nemean lions, defeated multi-headed hydras, and in passing cleaned out the huge Augean stables meant instantly and forever closing any disputes about your rightful right to command other people. In the eyes of superstitious contemporaries, this divine genealogy turned the figure of Cleobulus into something mythical, inviolable, and majestic. People began to see in the young man not merely the clever son of Evagrius, but a true living statue that had descended from lofty Olympus to bring order to chaos with an iron fist. However, if you have listened carefully to previous episodes on our channel, you surely remember that Cleobulus was far from the only one who played this trump card. In that era, the so-called Heraclidae thundered throughout Hellas. This sonorous term was used for the numerous descendants and heirs of the great Heracles who, according to legend, returned to the Peloponnese to take their rightful lands by right of blood. A true cult of strength and divine right to power enveloped entire dynasties. For example, the fierce Corinthian tyrant sage Periander, also one of the 7 sages, belonged to the Cypselid family, closely connected with this mythical blood, and the stern Spartan Epherchelon, another hero of our past stories, relied on the iron tradition of Sparta, where both royal houses unconditionally considered themselves direct descendants of the great hero. For Cleobulus, to declare his kinship with Heracles meant to stand in a row with these titans of the era, confirming that his power over Rhodes was sanctioned by the gods themselves. It is no secret that the rumors about the greatness of certain gentlemen often exceed their actual merits, but in the case of Cleobulus, this myth of divine blood fell on exceptionally fertile ground. And, of course, Cleobulus understood these rules of the game perfectly well. The youth position was also strengthened by his very name. He wore it together with the halo of his mythical origin like an invisible but dazzling armor, which made enemies doubt their victory even before the battle began, and made subjects bow their knees in sacred awe before the legendary force flowing from the depths of time. You know, in antiquity, people took names much more seriously than we do today. In our time, a boy might be named after his grandfather, a popular actor, or simply because the combination of sounds harmonizes nicely with the surname. For the ancient Greeks, it was different. For them, a name was not merely a label, but a kind of road map that the gods issued to a person at birth, or if you will, a contract with fate itself. The name Cleobulus translates from Greek as glorious in counsel or renowned in counsel. It must be said that this name enjoyed enormous respect and popularity among the Hellenic aristocracy in the ancient world. Parents, by naming their sons thus, were clearly programming them for a brilliant political career. We meet this name in many prominent families of ancient Greece. For example, history has preserved for us the memory of Cleobulus, who was the father of the famous Athenian commander and strategist Nicias, the very man whose decisions determined the fate of Athens during the grueling Peloponnesian War. For the Greeks, this name rang with nobility. It was associated with the ability to lead people not by the force of shouting, but by the power of persuasion in popular assemblies. Looking at Cleobulus of Lindos, it is hard to shake the thought that either his parents possessed the gift of foresight, or the boy from early childhood exerted maximum effort to live up to the advance given to him. Such a name was ideally suited for a man who was later destined to enter the canonical list of the Seven Sages of Greece. In a society where the main instrument of politics and philosophy was the living, spoken word, the ability to give precise, weighty, and timely advice was valued at its weight in gold. The Greeks gathered in squares and council chambers not to listen to empty demagoguery. They sought laconic wisdom capable of resolving a protracted dispute or indicating a way out of a state deadlock. When Cleobulus grew up and took his place on the platforms of Lindos, his fellow citizens quickly became convinced that the meaning of his name fully coincided with reality. His speeches were not like the endless effusions of street orators. He spoke rarely, but every word of his fell on the minds of listeners with leaden weight. The nickname Glorious in Council became his main title, respected even by his bitterest political opponents. This was a time when wisdom had not yet separated from practical life and harsh governance. To be renowned in council meant to possess that rare type of mind that sees the essence of things through any fog of human passions and illusions. Cleobulus proved to all of Hellas that his name was prophetic, for his advice outlived the very era in which it was given. When we try to understand exactly how Cleobulus came to power in Lindos in the 6th century before Christ, we encounter a delightful confusion in the testimony of ancient authors. Clement of Alexandria, for example, piously calls Cleobulus a king, creating a picture of a legitimate and orderly ascent to the throne by right of inheritance from his father Evagrius. However, the perceptive Plutarch and most other ancient historians without further ceremony call him a tyrant. To the modern ear, this sounds like a death sentence, but in archaic Greece of the 6th century before Christ, tyranny was not a diagnosis, but a highly effective political technology. To understand exactly how the young athlete Cleobulus pulled off this trick, we need to discard pious myths and look at the economy of Rhodes. In that era, Lindos was literally suffocating from the dominance of the old landed aristocracy, a clique of oligarchs who had taken over all the courts, the best lands, and, most importantly, the income from maritime trade. Ordinary citizens, the demos, consisting of daring captains, prosperous craftsmen, dockworkers, and thousands of sailors, earned millions for the city but had no voice in the council. Tension grew, and to topple these arrogant gentlemen from their perches, the demos needed a leader of a very special kind. They needed a man who combined the cold mind of a strategist, noble birth for legitimacy, and the authority of a street leader capable, if necessary, of breaking an opponent's spine. Cleobulus was ideally suited for this role. The mechanics of his coup were classic for that turbulent century. Cleobulus did not arrange secret conspiracies in dark corners. He acted openly and on a grand scale. First, he used his oratorical skill and authority as a man renowned in council to publicly accuse the ruling oligarchy of corruption and embezzlement of public funds. When the crowd in the port of Lindos was sufficiently heated, Cleobulus, using his enormous personal fortune, armed at his own expense a powerful detachment of loyal veterans and the strongest fellows from among the sailors. Relying on this improvised guard and the direct support of the rebellious people, he blocked the aristocrats in their country villas and occupied the city Acropolis, the main citadel of Lindos. Diogenes Laertius hints that this transfer of power took place without much bloodshed. The Rhodian oligarchs were practical men. They preferred to quickly pack their bags and cede the throne to a man behind whom stood the entire enraged port, while he himself had the dimensions of a blacksmith hammer. In essence, Cleobulus became a sole military dictator who took power not by right of an ancient crown, but by right of strength and with the tacit consent of the majority. Holding on to this power on an island where every second merchant considered himself an uncrowned king was a more difficult task than simply capturing the Acropolis. Cleobulus ruled for 40 years, and this fact in itself is the best proof of his genius. In the 6th century before Christ, rulers rarely died of old age. Usually, their careers ended much earlier from a conspirator dagger or poison in a wine cup. The fact that Cleobulus managed not only to survive among these Rhodian intriguers, but also to make Plutarch acknowledge that his rule brought prosperity to the city speaks volumes. This gentleman knew how to tie knots so that no one in the Mediterranean dared to untie them. He finally eliminated the judicial privileges of the nobility, subordinated all duties from incoming ships to the state treasury, and turned Lindos into an impregnable naval base, where the law of the tyrant became synonymous with iron order for all classes. 40 years of absolute power on a single island in the 6th century before Christ is not merely a political record. It is a true historical miracle. Most people cannot even calmly manage their own family for a week. Yet this gentleman held an entire state by the throat for 40 years, a state overflowing with ambitious merchants and mercenaries. To understand how vast this period is, we need to lift our heads from the shores of Rhodes and look at the tectonic shifts that were shaking the rest of the planet at that very moment. While Cleobulus in the silence of his palace calmly drank aged wine and devised laws about moderation, the world order around him was collapsing and reassembling with the roar of falling cliffs. Speaking of the ruler wine selection, it is worth telling in more detail, for the alcohol culture of that time was the most important part of big politics. In the 6th century before Christ, the Greeks knew neither vodka, nor whiskey, nor beer, which the Hellenes arrogantly considered a filthy drink of northern barbarians. The only legitimate alcoholic beverage was wine, but it would never have occurred to Cleobulus to drink it the way modern gentlemen do. The Hellenes never drank wine as it was delivered from winemakers. Drinking undiluted wine was considered a sure sign of savagery, alcoholism, and a guaranteed way to quickly go mad. Wine was always diluted with clean water in a special large bowl, a crater, and the classic proportion was 3 parts water to 1 part wine, or on particularly festive occasions 1 to 2. Pure wine was used only as a disinfectant for wounds or for sacred drops during religious sacrifices. Rhodes itself was famous for its magnificent sweet muscat wines, but Cleobulus' status allowed him to choose the best of what merchants brought to the port of Lindos. On his table, there surely were famous thick and dark wines from the islands of Chios and Lesbos, which were worth their weight in gold, as well as aromatic amphipolitan wine with the taste of dried grapes. To keep the drink from spoiling in clay amphorae during long voyages, the Greeks added seawater, honey, gypsum, tree resin, and aromatic herbs such as thyme and mint. To the taste of a modern sommelier, this brew would more likely resemble a thick syrup or cough mixture, but for the people of the 6th century before Christ, it was the nectar of the gods. Wine drinking in Rhodes was subject to the iron rules of symposia, ritual feasts where at the head of the table sat the symposiarch, a director who strictly determined how many cups would be drunk and to what degree of dilution the wine would reach that evening. For Cleobulus, who made the golden mean his main philosophical motto, the ability to dilute wine with water in time was the best metaphor for wise state governance. If we turn to biblical history, the 40-year rule of Cleobulus perfectly coincides with the darkest, most catastrophic, and yet greatest era of ancient Israel. It was in these decades that Jerusalem fell under the blows of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar with all the ensuing consequences. While Cleobulus was building new temples in Lindos, the Babylonians razed the first temple, the famous Temple of Solomon, to the ground. The entire Jewish elite was put in chains and taken into the famous 70-year Babylonian captivity. The Jewish prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel at this time mourned the destruction of their kingdom by the rivers of Babylon. Toward the end of Cleobulus' rule, the Persian king Cyrus the Great burst onto the geopolitical scene, destroying Babylon itself and redrawing the map of the Middle East. Against this background, 40 years of stability on Rhodes look as if Cleobulus managed to build a quiet and prosperous estate right on the top of an erupting volcano. If we move to the other end of the Eurasian continent, to mysterious East Asia, then there its own monumental history was unfolding. On the Korean peninsula and in southern Manchuria, these 40 years coincided with the heyday of the powerful state of Gojoseon, also known as Ancient Joseon. It was a highly developed civilization that in the 6th century before Christ was creating its own unique legal system. The famous Code of 8 prohibitive laws aimed at protecting private property and social harmony. Direct trade between Rhodes and Korea, of course, did not exist in those days due to the colossal distances. Yet both of these points on the planet were connected by the invisible threads of the Great Steppe Route, through which advanced technologies were transmitted via nomads. At the same time, the civilizations were at different stages of technological development. Greece had made its transition from bronze to iron 4 centuries before Cleobulus, while Gojoseon in the 6th century before Christ was just at the peak of its magnificent bronze culture and was only beginning to master iron smelting. These were two completely different universes with their own monumental approaches to statehood and order, but each in its own way sought to tame chaos. During these 40 years, Confucius had time to be born and grow up in China. Siddhartha Gautama began to preach in India, and in Rome, the penultimate king, Servius Tullius, ruled. The world around Rhodes was seething, fighting, praying, and going mad with its own ambitions. Entire empires were born from dust and turned to ashes in the time it took one handsome athlete with Carian roots to hold power in a small Mediterranean port. Cleobulus clearly proved to humanity that 40 years of wise rule can weigh as much in history as all the thundering chariots of the warlike Nebuchadnezzar, for his aqueduct remained standing, while great Babylon turned into a pile of clay shards. When a modern person hears the word tyrant, his imagination immediately conjures a gloomy paranoid in an armored bunker who signs execution lists before breakfast and sees conspiracies everywhere. Mark Twain once remarked that the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the same as between lightning and the glow of a firefly. So, in the archaic era of Greece in the 6th century before Christ, the status of a tyrant shimmered with completely different colors and did not necessarily mean terrifying cruelty. For the Rhodian merchants and sailors, a tyrant was rather a synonym for a crisis manager who was invited to restore order when the council of the local nobility had finally driven the state into a dead end. Historical facts and legal analysis of that time convincingly indicate that Cleobulus, apparently, held the position that the Greeks called the sonorous and extremely respectable term isimnetes. To understand the essence of this complex phenomenon, we need to look into the works of Aristotle, who in his Politics directly called isimnesia elective tyranny. This was not a gang seizure of power with weapons in hand. An isimnetes is an officially elected dictator, a supreme arbiter and legislator to whom the popular assembly consciously, voluntarily, and on the basis of law delegated absolute power during a time of severe internal crisis, economic catastrophe, or threat of civil war. In essence, this was the only legal way to temporarily suspend protracted democratic debates in order to save the state itself. Imagine a large modern corporation that finds itself on the verge of bankruptcy due to endless squabbles and lawsuits between shareholders. What do in such a situation? They do not close the firm. They hire a tough CEO from outside, give him 100% carte blanche, emergency powers, and the legal right to fire anyone who interferes with the business. It was precisely such an invited top manager with unlimited powers on the scale of the city of Lindos that Cleobulus became. The citizens of Rhodes themselves placed the reins of power in his hands, not for him to plunder their barns, but for him, with his judicial hammer, to smash the shackles of the oligarchic conspiracy and rewrite the laws in favor of the whole society. To appreciate the sophistication of Cleobulus' position, it is worth comparing him with another hero of our channel, the Corinthian tyrant Periander. He was a classic usurper without any prefixes like crisis manager. Periander held power in Corinth with the help of a professional guard of mercenaries, total surveillance, confiscation of the property of the rich, and public executions of any potential opposition. Periander relied on pure, unadulterated fear, and Plutarch later wrote that this Corinthian ruler constantly balanced on the edge of paranoia. Cleobulus acted exactly the opposite. As an isimnetes, he did not need to prove the legitimacy of his power with the severed heads of aristocrats. If Periander destroyed outstanding citizens of the city to prevent them from rising up in rebellion, then Cleobulus, on the contrary, invited the wisest men to his council and himself sought dialogue with them. Their approaches to governance differed as much as an executioner axe differs from a surgeon's scalpel. Periander built despotism for personal safety, while Cleobulus used his elective dictatorship to create working laws that protected ordinary merchants from the arbitrariness of the nobility. Usually, isimnetae were hired for a strictly defined term, for example, for 1 year or until the resolution of a specific problem, such as the payment of external debts, as was the case with Pittacus on Lesbos. However, The case of Cleobulus is unique. This elite political practice in his hands turned into a 40-year era of unprecedented prosperity. Why did this happen? Simply because the systemic crisis into which the old family clans had driven Rhodes required not cosmetic repair, but long, systematic, and continuous work. Cleobulus understood that if he stepped down after a year, the oligarchs would return and auction off the city. Instead of erecting gallows for his opponents and breeding personal enemies, the Aesomnetes Cleobulus engaged in large-scale structural reforms. He understood perfectly well that the best defense against coups was not an army of hired bodyguards, but a well-fed, content, and armed demos from whom no one dared to take the money honestly earned from maritime trade. His dictatorship was effective, pragmatic, and, as subsequent biographers noted with surprise, exceptionally bloodless. Cleobulus clearly demonstrated to the Greek world that absolute power in the hands of a wise man could be not a curse, but the only effective cure for social anarchy. In those days, large construction projects were the best way to keep the port demos busy during lulls in maritime trade, and Cleobulus, with true Hellenic pragmatism, tried to squeeze the maximum out of this opportunity. Having seized power and brought order to the port terminals, he immediately set about what today would be called large-scale renovation and sacred urban planning. His main monumental project was the large-scale renovation of the famous temple of Athena Lindia, which sat proudly on the very top of the city Acropolis. According to legend, the first temple on this site was founded by the legendary King Danaus, who arrived from Egypt, but Cleobulus turned the archaic sanctuary into a true masterpiece. Thousands of stonecutters, carpenters, and ordinary laborers received a steady wage from the state treasury, which the tyrant had shortly before filled with duties from the oligarchs. The Lindian Acropolis itself is a colossal sheer cliff 116 meters above sea level, which literally grows out of the azure waters of the Mediterranean. It is the second largest acropolis in Greece after the Athenian one, and it remained continuously fortified and inhabited for 3,000 years, from Mycenaean times until the end of the Middle Ages. It was an ideal place for a fortress and at the same time the main religious center of all Rhodes. The Temple of Athena had stood there from time immemorial, but Cleobulus decided to turn it into a dazzling symbol of his rule and the power of Lindos. He did not merely straighten the crumbling walls, but practically rebuilt the sanctuary, inviting the best architects and stonecutters of his century. Under him, the modest archaic building was clad in noble local limestone and marble, receiving majestic colonnades that were visible to passing merchant ships many miles before approaching the harbor. Cleobulus turned the cult of Athena the provider into the main ideological stronghold of his dictatorship, through the architectural temple ensemble clearly demonstrating to his subjects that his power was protected not only by the shields of his guards, but also by the spear of the goddess of wisdom and just war. The temple was built in the Doric order, the strictest, most powerful, and most masculine of all Greek architectural styles. The Doric style got its name from one of the three main ancient Greek tribes, the Dorians. This style is very easy to recognize by the design of the columns. They have no fancy decorations at the top or bottom, but seem to grow straight out of the stone floor. They have no intricate carvings in the form of acanthus leaves or scrolls. Everything is simple, stern, and powerful. The columns widen slightly toward the middle, a technique architects call entasis, to create the impression that they are slightly strained under the weight of the roof. The flutes on the column shaft play in the sun, creating a play of light and shadow. The Doric style is architecture without unnecessary words, like Spartan laconic brevity, only in stone. This was the style Cleobulus chose, no ostentatious luxury, only strength, order, and austere beauty. The temple of Athena Lindia became a true center of power, where pilgrims and expensive offerings flocked from all corners of the Hellenic world. Pilgrims climbed the steep stairs, passed through the monumental propylaea, and found themselves before the temple, where priests kept the ancient cult image of the goddess, which, according to legend, had fallen from the sky. Here, a unique slab from the 3rd century before Christ has been preserved, listing the names of citizens who donated olive oil for the temple lamps, indirect evidence that the religious center flourished for centuries. All the political intrigues of the 6th century before Christ have long been erased from human memory, but Cleobulus' grandiose urban planning gesture proved stronger than time. Today, only the lowest part of the foundation, the base, and fragments of columns remain from the temple, lying where they fell during earthquakes. But even these ruins of the archaic temple on the top of the Acropolis make a strong impression. And right in front of the temple, on a stone slab, a relief is carved, the bow of an ancient ship, dedicated to Athena in gratitude for the salvation of sailors. Ship, war, wisdom, and power, all of this came together on the sacred rock, which Cleobulus turned into a monument to his rule. The inhabitants of ancient Lindos could be as proud as they wished that their ruler Cleobulus traced his lineage to Heracles himself and composed exquisite poetry. But in the arid Mediterranean climate of Rhodes, they needed something more down to earth and practical, namely clean drinking water. Understanding that one could not stay in power for long on mythical authority alone, this pragmatic dictator initiated a project that forever inscribed his name in the history of world hydraulic engineering. One of the main achievements of his rule was the large-scale construction of a city water supply system, which modern archaeologists call the Krana Aqueduct. To appreciate the scale of this engineering audacity, one must understand the specific nature of Lindos itself. The city grew around an impregnable, sun-scorched stone acropolis. The entire island of Rhodes is composed primarily of hard limestone rock, and digging underground passages in such stone with bare hands was a task for Hercules. Delivering water from distant sources was always the main nightmare for local housewives and port quartermasters. Cleobulus approached the solution of the problem with truly royal scope and mathematical precision, which he apparently picked up during his philosophical journey to Egypt. By his order, ancient engineers and builders laid out a complex network of underground galleries in the rock. This system, as shown by recent speleological studies, consists of tunnels extending for at least 2 kilometers and on 2 levels. 2 levels was not an accident. The upper level collected water from mountain springs. The lower level served as the main trunk channel, delivering it by natural slope to the city. Physics worked like clockwork here. Gravity did everything itself, without pumps or slaves with buckets. The entire structure resembled a giant underground river directed by human hand. Above ground, the system was served by 22 wells, which archaeologists still find today, often at the intersections of ancient streets. Through these wells, slaves or attendants descended into the tunnels for cleaning and repairs. They collected water from mountain springs deep in the island and, with a flawlessly calculated natural slope, delivered it directly to public reservoirs and fountains at the foot of the Acropolis. Archaeologists consider it very likely that it was during the time of Cleobulus that the first full-fledged hydraulic system of Lindos was created, with galleries carved into the rock or clay soil. And to this day, at the square at the entrance to modern Lindos, a fountain flows that has preserved its ancient Dorian name, Krana, and the water in it has been flowing continuously since antiquity. The most amazing thing about this project is its quality and durability, which makes modern hydraulic engineers pale. Some authors directly link the dating of the aqueduct to the 6th century before Christ, the time of the rule of the tyrant Cleobulus, whom ancient sources characterize as a very democratic, popular, and progressive ruler. This ancient system supplied Lindos with clean water uninterruptedly for centuries, surviving the Hellenistic era, Roman rule, and the Byzantine period right up to the deep Middle Ages. Cleobulus clearly demonstrated to the entire ancient world that the best monument for a sage is not golden statues, which his political successors would melt down at the first financial crisis anyway, but functioning public utilities. The inhabitants of ancient Hellas certainly valued clever philosophers who could discourse for hours on lofty matters. But truly, they bowed only before those fellows who could personally put on a helmet, lead an army, and crush their neighbors to dust. The chronicles convincingly prove that Cleobulus was an exceptionally tough and successful military commander. The result of his campaigns was the large-scale conquest of Lycia, a wealthy region on the coast of Asia Minor. To understand the motives of our sage, one needs to look at the map of the Mediterranean. Lycia was a large peninsula, indented with many cozy bays that served as an ideal home for local pirates. Since the time of the Trojan War, these fellows had been engaged in maritime robbery. Lindos, meanwhile, was a peaceful trading port, and its purse depended entirely on the safety of sea routes. The warlike Lycians regularly plundered Rhodian merchants, preventing them from transporting goods to Egypt. Cleobulus solved this problem in the spirit of a good Texas Ranger. Instead of endlessly fending off coastal raids, he gathered a powerful fleet, loaded heavy infantry and mercenaries onto ships, and then personally led the expedition. Cleobulus' military campaign became a model of strategic art. The crushing power of the Greek phalanx was combined with cunning diplomatic maneuvers, in which the ruler of Lindos happily pitted local chieftains against each other. The Lycians were desperate fellows, and their unique tombs, carved right into sheer cliffs, inspired terror in their neighbors. However, against the systemic genius of Cleobulus, they could not stand. The Rhodian tyrant did not merely plunder the coast. He methodically subjugated the key cities, imposed heavy tribute on them, and forced them to recognize the supremacy of Lindos. Before continuing, we will make a small digression that will help you orient yourself as to which lands are being discussed. Lycia, conquered by Cleobulus, became nearly 9 centuries later the homeland of the Christian Saint Nicholas the Wonderworker, whose name every child on the planet knows today, albeit in a completely different guise. In the 4th century after Christ, in the Lycian city of Patara, a boy named Nicholas was born. He became the bishop of the city of Myra, the capital of Lycia, and became famous for many good deeds. For his secret habit of tossing bags of gold at night into the windows of the poor, he turned over the centuries in the public consciousness into the main Christmas giver. The very name Santa Claus is merely a distorted Dutch pronunciation of the name of Saint Nicholas. Dutch settlers brought this image to America, where it acquired reindeer, became firmly associated with chimneys and a red coat. So behind every Christmas gift under your tree still stands the shadow of that Lycian bishop, and behind him, even deeper in the centuries, the figure of the tyrant Cleobulus, whose soldiers once brought Hellenic order to this warlike corner of the ancient world. The victory over Lycia instantly turned the modest island city into a true maritime superpower. Naturally, in international affairs of that time, the best argument was not elegant rhetoric, but a well-trained army capable of quickly rounding out the borders of your state at the expense of your neighbors. At the same time, no less well fortified the state borders and the loyalty of subjects were the gold-filled purses of citizens and the port warehouses bursting with foreign goods. Cleobulus of Lindos learned this truth perfectly during his early philosophical journeys. When this perceptive athlete secured his throne and pacified internal strife, he did not waste time on empty demagoguery, but immediately began turning Lindos into one of the most powerful, influential, and aggressive trading centers of the entire civilized world of that time. During the 40-year rule of Cleobulus, the modest island city launched such a colossal economic expansion that the old trading houses of mainland Greece only counted their losses in astonishment. Cleobulus' main trump card was intelligent and systematic colonization of key points in the Mediterranean. Instead of simply plundering foreign shores, as his warlike Carian ancestors had done, this elected dictator acted like a far-sighted chairman of the board of directors of a multinational corporation. By his order, Lindian ships set off to establish new subsidiaries, that is, colonies, along the entire coast, securing themselves on the most profitable trade routes from Sicily to Asia Minor. Each such colony became a loyal outpost of Lindos, which seamlessly pumped raw materials, metals, and slaves into the metropolis, in turn absorbing surplus goods and ensuring absolute Rhodian naval dominance. Cleobulus created a system in which every talent of gold invested in the construction of a merchant ship returned to the city treasury threefold. Thanks to this aggressive and intelligent commercial policy, Lindos under Cleobulus tied the strongest diplomatic and economic knots with the main political players of the era. The city maintained constant, incredibly profitable ties with strategically important Cyprus, rich in metals, and, of course, with mainland Greece. But Cleobulus' main triumph was the special, exclusive relationship with Egypt. Rhodian merchants received unique privileges in Naucratis, the only Egyptian port open to Greek traders, which allowed Lindos to monopolize the supply of Egyptian grain, papyrus, and luxury goods. Cleobulus managed to prove to the entire ancient world a simple truth, namely that the wisdom of a ruler is measured not by the number of abstract treatises he wrote, but by the number of merchant galleys that daily enter your harbor, turning yesterday fishermen into respectable and very wealthy gentlemen. It is worth noting that a truly great ruler differs from an ordinary one in that after his departure, the country does not turn back into a remote province, but continues to produce geniuses capable of shaking the imagination of humanity. Cleobulus of Lindos, during his 40-year vacation on the throne, laid such a solid economic and cultural foundation that his native city long remained the main forge of elite personnel for the entire Mediterranean. The best and most dazzling proof of this continuity of generations was the appearance of a man whose name made even those who had never heard of the Seven Sages talk about Lindos. One of the most famous and celebrated natives of this city after Cleobulus was the brilliant sculptor Chares, who went down in history as the creator of the legendary Colossus of Rhodes, one of the seven wonders of the world. To understand how the elected dictator of the 6th century before Christ and the great sculptor of the beginning of the 3rd century before Christ are connected, one must look at where Chares even got the resources for his cyclopean construction. Chares was a devoted student of the great Lysippus, the court master of Alexander the Great himself, and inherited from him a passion for gigantic scale. When Rhodes successfully withstood a colossal year-long siege by the Macedonian king Demetrius Poliorcetes, the grateful islanders decided to erect a giant statue of the sun god Helios. They obtained the money for this project by simply selling the enemy abandoned siege engines, and it was here that those very riches, port docks, and foundry traditions that Lindos had developed since the time of Cleobulus came in handy. Chares approached the task with truly Lindian scope, spending 12 years of exhausting labor on the construction of a 30-meter-tall bronze giant. The irony of this story is that the Colossus of Rhodes stood in its place for only about 50 years, after which it collapsed during a powerful earthquake, breaking at the knees. But even in its fallen form, this pile of bronze continued to be a wonder of the world, for which thousands of Roman tourists sailed to Rhodes, leaving their denarii in local taverns. Chares of Lindos immortalized his native city in stone and metal, but he did so on the very stage that, 2 centuries before him, had been carefully prepared, cleared of pirates, and supplied with first-class plumbing by the sage Cleobulus. The great Colossus became the logical culmination of that era of prosperity that began with Carian mercenaries, divine myths of Heracles, and the precise, timely policies of one very wise ruler. There is an opinion that a good forgery often looks far more convincing and beautiful than the dull and gray historical truth itself. After all, real historical figures have the stupidity to die without leaving behind convenient textbook quotes, while the authors of later forgeries can make any sage say exactly what the admiring public expects. In the biography of Cleobulus of Lindos, there is one delightful plot twist connected with the epistolary heritage of antiquity. A rather intriguing letter has come down to us, in which the Rhodian ruler politely invites the famous Athenian legislator Solon to come to Lindos and find there a reliable refuge from the despotic tyranny of Pisistratus. The text of this message looks flawless from the point of view of the laws of dramaturgy. Cleobulus writes to Solon that on Rhodes, complete freedom reigns, the people are devoted to their Aesimnetes, and Lindos itself is an ideal maritime city where the old sage can spend the rest of his days in peace and safety, without fear of Athenian pursuers. It is a beautiful scene where one great mind of Hellas extends a helping hand to another great mind in trouble. However, modern historians, well versed in textual analysis, unanimously agree that this document is a later historical forgery. In ancient philology, there is even a special technical term for such things, pseudepigrapha, under which hide hundreds of letters, speeches, and treatises brazenly attributed to the great men of the past. The authors of this forgery were most likely Alexandrian readers or later Greek sophists who made a living by composing effective exercises for their students. For them, it was the height of chic to imagine how Cleobulus might have supported Solon and to pass off this flight of fancy as an archive scroll found in a port library. The fact that the real Cleobulus himself was officially considered a tyrant, while the letter vehemently condemns the tyranny of Pisistratus, did not bother these ancient forgers in the least. Historical science has ruthlessly destroyed this myth of the friendship between the 2 sages, but the very existence of this forged letter proves one important thing. In the eyes of subsequent generations, Cleobulus possessed such an impeccable reputation as a just ruler that his name seemed the ideal brand for the defense of freedom, even if that freedom had to be fabricated from the first to the last word. Nature has a delightful sense of humor when it gives great men heirs. For one genius father is too often matched by a dozen sons whose intellectual potential does not exceed the wit of a field scarecrow. Cleobulus of Lindos was extremely lucky in this genetic casino, although fate played a joke on him by the standards of the patriarchal 6th century before Christ. He had no sons to whom he could pass his wrestler belt and the Asimnete's judicial hammer. But Cleobulus had a single daughter who inherited from her father 100% of his famous mind and pragmatism. At birth, the girl was given a very beautiful and symbolic name, Midas. Literally translated from ancient Greek, this name meant prudent, which for the family of one of the 7 sages of Hellas was not merely a nod to fashion, but a true declaration of family values. However, this talented young lady entered world history, literature, and philosophy under a completely different, far more famous name, Cleobulina, which literally translates as Little Cleobulus or Daughter of Cleobulus. The ancient Greeks, for all their love of verbal balancing, were extremely practical people, and if a daughter ruled the city alongside her father with the help of her brains, then it was fitting to call her accordingly. The fact that she became known by her father name in the feminine form clearly proves that in the eyes of the harsh Rhodian sailors and merchants, Midas was not merely a quiet homebound maiden, but the direct intellectual continuation of her great parent. Cleobulus did not hide Cleobulina in the women quarters behind a spinning wheel, as the arrogant Athenians did, but turned her into the main project of his life, initiating a concept of elite female education unique for that harsh century. When most Greek city-states kept their daughters tightly locked in the women quarters, a completely different historical scenario was unfolding on the island of Rhodes. The daughter of the Asimnetes, Cleobulus, not only received a first-class education, she became a famous poetess and an unsurpassed master of complex riddles, forcing the stern, bearded sages of Hellas to recognize her intellectual superiority. Today, Cleobulina is rightfully considered one of the very first, brightest, and most influential women in world literature, standing on the same historical step as the great Sappho of Lesbos. However, if Sappho sang of tender feelings, the torments of love, and created an entire era of lyric sensuality, then Cleobulina approached the poetic craft with pure Lindian, paternal pragmatism, and iron logic. Her main creative weapon was not love elegies but riddles, clothed in impeccable poetic form, most often in the solemn hexameter or elegiac distich. In those days, the riddle was not a child amusement, but a prestigious intellectual game for the elite, a vital part of symposia where men measured their sharpness of mind as eagerly as on the Olympic wrestling mat. Cleobulina composed her poetic puzzles with such mathematical precision and philosophical depth that solving them without serious preparation was decidedly impossible. She used metaphors and natural phenomena. Her poetic talent and skill were so great that her verses and riddles instantly spread throughout the Mediterranean, were copied by Alexandrian scholars, and quoted in the works of the greatest philosophers of later eras. Cleobulina managed to make a true literary revolution, proving to the arrogant gentlemen of Athens a simple truth. The female mind is capable of handling the harsh Greek hexameter and logical paradoxes no worse than her father Phalanx handled the Lycian pirates. While Sappho conquered the world with broken hearts, Cleobulina of Lindos conquered it with the pure, unadulterated power of her intellect, forever fixing her name in the golden fund of ancient culture. It is no secret that if your jokes or character traits have reached the stage of the Capitol theaters, then you have either finally won, or they have decided to publicly flog you at the establishment expense. In either case, it means absolute recognition of your colossal influence on the public. In the 5th century before Christ, the intellectual fame of the daughter of the Rhodian dictator Cleobulina was so enormous that she managed to cross sea borders without a visa and storm the theatrical stages of Athens, the main cultural metropolis of all Hellas. Local authors quickly realized that the image of a young lady who cracks the most complex logical puzzles like hazelnuts was ideal material for box office productions. The famous Athenian comic poet Cratinus, who in those days was considered the main rival of Aristophanes himself and knew a thing or two about good scandal, named one of his large-scale satirical plays simply and sonorously Cleobulina. Here it must be said in the style of modern Hollywood disclaimers that during the filming, no real Cleobulina was harmed. Her name and authority were so unshakable that the Athenian mockers did not dare to encroach on her sanctity. In this regard, she was far luckier than our old acquaintance Diogenes of Apollonia. If you remember our previous story, Diogenes, after a merciless caricature in Aristophanes' Clouds, literally had to save his own skin from the fury of the crowd and flee the city. The daughter of the Rhodian ruler avoided this fate. The Capitol stage did not destroy her life, but merely turned her name into an eternal monument to the female mind. To understand what tectonic furor this produced among the pampered Athenian spectators, one must recall the harsh local realities. In Athens, women of that era had no right to vote at all and sat locked up in the back rooms of their houses, occupied with spinning and pious silence. The appearance on stage of characters embodying the intelligent, independent, and sharp-tongued Cleobulina was something like an official visit by aliens for the local audience. Later, already in the 4th century before Christ, another prominent representative of the so-called Middle Comedy, the playwright Alexida, wrote another work with the exact same title. The main sorrow of modern philologists is that both of these comedic masterpieces have not survived to our days. Only tiny quotations from later authors remain from them. But the very fact of the existence of two independent plays from different eras proves that the name of Cleobulina was a truly durable brand in the ancient show business. Athenian comic poets, before becoming dusty classics from school textbooks, were very cynical craftsmen. They would never have wasted expensive papyrus and precious actor time on topics that did not interest the idle crowd in the theater of Dionysus. If Cratinus and Alexida built their plots around Cleobulina and her famous riddles, then this Rhodian girl made the Athenian gentlemen argue until they were hoarse right during intermissions. Her intellectual legacy proved so tenacious and daring that even centuries after the death of her great father, capital satirists used the image of Cleobulina to more painfully jab at local politicians. Through her mask, they proved to the arrogant Athenians that true wisdom still lived not in their noisy popular courts, but on the distant, wind-swept rock of the Lindian Acropolis. Let us once again say out loud what exactly happened. A classic once remarked that a man is capable of sincerely and hoarsely defending the most stupid and conservative prejudices of his time, exactly until those prejudices begin to directly interfere with the happiness or career of his own beloved daughter. Cleobulus of Lindos in this regard was no exception to the rules of human nature, but his personal family circumstances led to a genuine cultural revolution on Rhodes. This elected dictator went down in the history of Hellas not only as a strong athlete and wise legislator, but also as one of the most ardent, active supporters of the systematic education of women. For the 6th century BC, when most Greek thinkers sincerely believed that the highest virtue of a woman was that her name should never be mentioned among men, the position of Cleobulus looked like an open challenge to society. Of course, at the heart of this enlightened humanism lay very tangible, practical, and deeply personal motives. Since nature had given him a successor in a female form, this successor could and should be armed with the best knowledge that could be obtained in the Mediterranean. Instead of lamenting the absence of boys, he turned the upbringing of his daughter into the main intellectual experiment of his family life. He personally taught the girl rhetoric, philosophy, and poetic art, opening the doors of his palace to the best scholarly minds of that time. Seeing what phenomenal results Cleobulina achieved, the ruler of Lindos came to the logical conclusion that the female brain was constructed no worse than the male brain, and the general ignorance of Hellenic matrons was due solely to the lack of proper schools. Cleobulus began actively promoting the idea of female education among the Rhodian nobility, rightly believing that a strong mercantile state needed not merely obedient housewives, but intelligent, educated mothers capable of raising a new generation of thinking citizens. Cleobulus of Lindos proved himself in matters of family diplomacy to be a true carrion strategist and an outstanding economist of his time. His famous instruction, which has come down to us through the thickness of centuries, stated, "One should give their daughters in marriage as maidens in age, but as women in mind." Behind this short and elegant formulation lay a true ideological bomb of the archaic world, which literally undermined the foundations of the then harsh patriarchal order. In the 6th century before Christ, marriage in most Greek cities was a purely commercial transaction, a dry contract for the transfer of property and the production of legal heirs. Girls were married off very young, often at the age of 13, when they still could do nothing except spin wool and silently obey orders. Cleobulus categorically rebelled against this tradition. With his aphorism, he directly declared to all of Hellas that physical maturity was only half the matter. A girl had no right to cross the threshold of her husband's house if her brain was no better developed than that of a frightened child. She must enter a new family as a formed, educated woman in terms of her intellect, capable of conducting meaningful dialogue, managing the household economy, and raising children based on reason. In essence, Cleobulus demanded that Rhodian fathers not rush to get rid of their daughters for the sake of an immediate alliance, but invest time and money in their mental development. The ruler of Lindos himself clearly demonstrated this rule on the example of his own daughter Cleobulina, whose real name was Midas, meaning prudent. He made her a full-fledged intellectual partner and, judging by the evidence that has come down to us, never regretted it. Cleobulus understood perfectly well that a stupid wife could, in a couple of years, bankrupt even the most prosperous merchant house of Rhodes. At the same time, an educated companion would become the best ally for her husband in any life storms. The true value of a bride is measured not by the weight of her golden dowry, but by the sharpness of her mind and the quality of her education. Surprisingly, this revolutionary thought for Greece echoed ideas in other ends of the inhabited earth in those same ancient centuries. If we travel across the stormy sea east to ancient Jerusalem, we will find there the famous 31st proverb of King Solomon, which is still quoted by sages to this day. Solomon approached the question of the female mind from a purely practical point of view. In his 31st proverb, He describes the ideal woman not as a spineless ornament at all. On the contrary, Solomon's virtuous wife is a powerful investor and the chief executive officer of the family enterprise. She seeks wool and flax. She is like the merchant ships. She brings her food from afar. She considers a field and buys it. The king emphasizes that charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a wife who possesses wisdom is above any pearls. Ancient Jerusalem, following Lindos, recognized that family happiness is built on a high level of female intelligence. A parallel can also be drawn with the wisdom of the Far East. If we take another leap in space, for example, to the farthest edge of Asia, we will see that there, in Korea, female wisdom and education were also highly valued. And there was a code for this: Hayamo Yancho, wise mother, good wife. True, it is important to note that unlike Greece and Judea, in Korea this idea was formalized as a state doctrine significantly later, mainly in the 20th century, but it absorbed ancient traditions of honoring educated mothers. In Korean homes, the upbringing of daughters was of paramount importance. Girls were taught not merely handicrafts, but also classical philosophy, calligraphy, and poetry. Koreans believed that a woman was the chief architect of the domestic universe. A stupid and uneducated mother, in their opinion, was simply incapable of raising a great official or scholar. The brightest example of such upbringing was the poetess and artist of the 16th century, Shin Samdang. Her face adorned the large Korean banknote of 50,000 won, and her name became a household word in Korea for the ideal mother and wife, combining talents with wisdom. Thus, Cleobulus of Lindos with his wedding manifesto was in perfect harmony with the best ideas of the great civilizations of the past. A strong state begins with a healthy and strong home, and a strong home cannot be built if only a frivolous draft walks around in the head of its mistress. A maiden in age, but a woman in mind. This is the universal password to the prosperity of both the family and society in any era. The intellectual life of the family of Cleobulus was incredibly rich, resembling a closed elitist club for the main intellectuals of the Mediterranean. The most striking and staggering evidence of this high level is the fact that the great biographer Plutarch later preserved for history. He mentions that the daughter of the Rhodian dictator, Cleobulina, in her early youth, had a real, close intellectual friendship with Thales of Miletus himself. To understand the full monumentality of this friendship, one must realize exactly who this guest in the house of Cleobulus was. Thales of Miletus not only occupied an honorable place in the same official list of the Seven Sages of Greece as the ruler of Rhodes himself. Thales is rightfully considered the true patriarch of the entire European intellectual tradition, officially recognized as the very first philosopher in the history of mankind and the great founder of the famous Milesian school. When such a titan of thought came to Lindos, he sought not merely political alliances with the Achaemenids, but first and foremost the opportunity to talk with someone whose level of intellect allowed for understanding complex astronomical and mathematical calculations. The fact that Thales of Miletus conducted long, serious discussions with the young Cleobulina completely broke the usual patterns of that harsh century. Cleobulus managed to create a unique, nurturing environment in his palace, where his daughter grew up not only among flattering courtiers, but also in communication with a man who predicted solar eclipses and measured the height of the Egyptian pyramids by their shadow. This friendship with Thales became the best university for Cleobulina, finally fixing the Lindian dynasty status as one of the intellectual centers of archaic Hellas. It is well known that travel is a deadly blow to prejudice, fanaticism, and narrow-mindedness. And that is why a decent gentleman is simply obliged to pack his bags in time and go see how his neighbors at the other end of the civilized world manage to survive and do business. In the 6th century before Christ, for any ambitious Greek who wished to obtain a genuine, elite education, there was only one, absolutely uncontested route. They all sailed south. For a deep and comprehensive study of philosophy, state governance, and the exact sciences, Cleobulus of Lindos made a large-scale journey to mysterious and monumental Egypt. In those days, this was a common rule for all the great minds of Hellas, and the ruler of Rhodes walked this road long before Herodotus described it in detail. To appreciate the full pragmatism of this step, one must understand exactly what Egypt was for the Greeks of that time, who seemed like noisy and uncouth adolescents compared to that ancient civilization. In Egypt, Cleobulus encountered a state apparatus that had been functioning smoothly for thousands of years, and a priestly caste that had accumulated colossal archives of astronomical, mathematical, and engineering knowledge. The Rhodian ruler went there not to gawk at the pyramids and sigh over ruins, but for a rigorous internship in managing large masses of people. It was from the Egyptian priests that Cleobulus observed and studied in detail the principles of strict centralization of power, the foundations of large-scale stone construction, and most importantly, the complex hydraulic engineering technologies that he would later so brilliantly apply in designing the famous Lindian aqueduct. The Egyptian philosophy in which Cleobulus immersed himself differed radically from the future abstract disputes of the Athenian academics. It was extremely utilitarian, strict, and aimed at ordering chaos through rigid laws and mathematical measure. This foreign experience finally shaped Cleobulus as a statesman, returning him to Rhodes not merely as a strong carrion fighter, but as a cold-blooded technocrat who learned to look at political crises as engineering problems. Cleobulus managed to convert Egyptian wisdom into the hardest currency of his time, proving to his subjects that a few years spent in conversations with the Nile priests brought practical benefits to the state for decades. The true calling card and main intellectual triumph of Cleobulus of Lindos was the laconic aphorism pan metron ariston, which literally translated into modern language means everything in moderation is best, or, better yet, observe moderation. This short slogan became his official and most weighty contribution to the corpus of ideas of the Seven Sages of Greece. For mercantile Rhodes, this concept of the golden mean was not at all an abstract poetic metaphor, but a purely utilitarian economic and political tool. Cleobulus applied this rule daily in practice, for his entire 40-year dictatorship rested precisely on balance. As we already know, at his symposia, wine was never drunk neat. It was diluted strictly in a proportion that excluded both drunken brawling and dreary sobriety. In international politics, Cleobulus acted exactly the same way. He conquered Lycia for the sake of port security, but did not move the army further inland, so as not to strain the state treasury or provoke the Persian king. Moderation in taxes saved the demos from poverty and the merchants from the desire to rise up in rebellion, turning harsh Izamnesia into the most stable joint stock company of the Mediterranean. Cleobulus managed to sell the Greeks the most scarce idea on the planet, proving that the true greatness of a ruler lies not in building the largest and most meaningless empire, but in knowing when to stop. The aphorism pan metron ariston withstood the test of time far better than the walls of ancient fortresses, becoming the gold standard of ancient philosophy. Cleobulus clearly demonstrated to humanity that moderation is not weakness of character or cowardice, but the highest form of manifestation of strength and reason, accessible only to those gentlemen who can control their own ambitions with an iron fist for the sake of long-term benefit. A manifestation of true intelligence is the ability to control one's own tongue. Better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. In the 6th century before Christ, when Greek popular assemblies and market squares were overflowing with loudmouthed demagogues, this advice was more relevant than ever. These gentlemen were ready to shake the southern air for hours for their selfish interests and dubious political slogans. Cleobulus of Lindos, as the head of a large trading port and supreme judge, daily listened to hundreds of such orators. Over 40 years in power, he developed a strong and absolutely impenetrable professional immunity to human stupidity. His instructions against ignorance became the most important part of his philosophical legacy, turning into a practical survival guide for any thinking gentleman of the archaic era. Cleobulus directed his main blow against what he considered the main scourge of any healthy state, namely militant and noisy ignorance. He directly asserted that among mortals, stupidity is the most widespread and at the same time the cheapest commodity, and the passion for endless talk about nothing is a sure sign of total weakness of mind. In his brief commandments, the ruler of Rhodes harshly demanded that his fellow citizens first learn to listen and only then open their mouths. He rightly believed that wise nature had not accidentally given man 2 ears and only 1 tongue, hinting at the correct proportions for using these instruments. For Cleobulus, the ability to bite 1 tongue in time was a direct continuation of his famous concept of the golden mean. An extra word in heated political debates or during a delicate trade deal could cost a local ship magnate an entire fortune, and the ruler of Lindos himself, stability and order in the city. In this endless war against verbal garbage, Cleobulus of Lindos was far from alone. If we leave the noisy Rhodian docks for a while and look into harsh, scarred Sparta, we will find there a like-minded person of Cleobulus on the list of the 7 sages. We are talking about the famous Emperor Chelon of Sparta. It was Chelon who raised the art of silence to an absolute cult and became the father of what we today call laconic speech. The Spartan sage brought the economy of words to such perfection that his phrases resembled the precise strikes of a heavy spearman. Chelon taught his fellow citizens that the tongue should not outrun thought, and empty chatter in Sparta was equated with shameful desertion from the battlefield. The Spartan sage brought the economy of words to such perfection that his phrases resembled the precise strikes of a heavy spearman. Chelon taught his fellow citizens that the tongue should not outrun thought, and empty chatter in Sparta was equated with shameful desertion from the battlefield. There is a separate long story on our channel about how Chelon introduced this speech minimalism with an iron fist and why the Athenian lovers of talk were mortally afraid of him, which you can easily find in the video archive. The Spartans, thanks to Chelon, learned to respond to long embassy speeches with a single word, proving that the true power of the mind lies in the concentration of meaning, not in the volume of water poured out on the listener. Cleobulus also approached the hygiene of communication with truly dictatorial uncompromisingness, which would have pleased even the harsh Spartans. He urged his subjects to mercilessly drive away professional talkers, gossips, and market demagogues from decent society. The The sage from Lindos understood perfectly well that empty and meaningless speeches liquefy the collective brain of a nation much faster than the cheapest undiluted port wine. Most people are born with an irresistible, almost painful desire to constantly shake the air with their own voice, because of which they spend a colossal amount of energy uttering nonsense, instead of simply sitting in silence and getting smarter for free at the expense of those around them. In the 6th century before Christ, when every free citizen of a Greek city-state considered it his sacred duty to shout down his neighbor at the popular assembly, this passion for one's own rhetoric acquired the proportions of a national disaster. Cleobulus of Lindos, being a man of action and a pragmatic Isymnetes, looked at this fair of vanity with deep professional cynicism. One of his most famous, authoritative, and frequently quoted pieces of advice that has come down to our days is the laconic commandment, "Love to listen, not to speak." Behind this simple and intuitively understandable phrase lay a purely applied political strategy that allowed Cleobulus to hold power on Rhodes for 40 years without a single major uprising. As the supreme arbiter and crisis manager of the city, he understood perfectly well that a loudmouth in the square always reveals his true motives, secret fears, and hidden ambitions in his very first phrases. He who knows how to be silent and listen instantly gains a colossal strategic advantage, for he gathers information while his opponents voluntarily reveal their cards. Cleobulus accustomed his administration and advisors to act precisely in this manner, turning state governance into a session of cold-blooded observation of the weaknesses of his subjects. This advice of the sage was the best cure for stupidity that Cleobulus prescribed to the entire Hellenic elite. According to his deep conviction, the ability to control one's own tongue is the highest manifestation of personal virtue and self-control. A man who loves to listen constantly enriches his inner capital, absorbing other people's experience, other people's mistakes, and crumbs of other people's wisdom, while an incorrigible talker only irrevocably squanders his meager intellectual resources. This short maxim of Cleobulus became the most important element of ancient pedagogy, clearly proving that the true greatness of a leader is measured not by the volume of his speeches from the podium, but by his ability to hear the truth in the chaos of port noise and draw the right conclusions in time. A person's private life is called personal precisely because it categorically cannot be put on public display. When a married couple begins to publicly demonstrate their feelings, or, even worse, stage stormy scenes in front of their neighbors, they turn their private life into a cheap fairground theater where the spectators are guaranteed to come out ahead, while the actors themselves inevitably end up as fools. In an era when the public spaces of Greek cities were a place of constant and merciless social control, any wrong move in the presence of strangers could instantly destroy the reputation of the most influential citizen. Cleobulus of Lindos, being a perceptive ruler and connoisseur of human psychology, recorded this harsh observation of life in the form of a strict and incredibly practical rule of self-control. His instructions stated that one should neither scold nor caress one's wife in the presence of other people. The sage from Lindos approached this everyday question with purely male, cold-blooded pragmatism, giving a very precise, cynical justification for each of these two prohibitions. Explaining why one should not arrange public family squabbles, Cleobulus directly pointed out that the first, that is, scolding in public, looks absolutely indecent. A man who stoops to shouting and mutual reproaches with his wife in the presence of witnesses admits to his own weakness, loss of control over the situation, and inability to bring order to his own home. Such a public flogging of family values instantly undermines the authority of a merchant or politician in the eyes of the port demos and business partners, turning him from a serious statesman into an object of banal street ridicule and gossip. The second part of his advice looks even more intriguing, for Cleobulus categorically forbade showing excessive tenderness to his wife in front of witnesses for the reason that it could drive those around him into genuine rage. The ruler of Rhodes knew well the price of human envy and hypocrisy. Public hugs, kisses, and saccharine caresses often evoke not tenderness in outside observers, but irritation, deep malice, and a sense of awkwardness. In the harsh mercantile society where everyone fought for survival and status, the demonstration of another family happiness seemed like a challenge and the height of bad manners. Cleobulus taught the Rhodian nobility to keep their emotions under the iron lock of reason, rightly believing that true family well-being requires silence, and a gentleman's perfect manners are tested by the ability to remain impeccably restrained in any situation. Many people confuse strength with ordinary violence, and high social position with the right to insult with impunity those who have been less fortunate in this life. In truth, sincere contempt for those below is a sure sign that a man himself deep down remains a petty lackey who has accidentally been entrusted with managing a decent house. Cleobulus of Lindos, governing a bustling, multinational port city for 40 years, understood perfectly well that the stability of a state rests not on fear of mercenaries, but on the strict rules of mutual respect and iron self-control. His famous code of conduct, which has come down to us in laconic aphorisms, contained 3 fundamental prohibitions. Do nothing with violence. Never despise those who are below you in status, and do not be inconstant or ungrateful. The first rule of Cleobulus demanded that citizens categorically renounce violence as a method of solving any problems. For a tyrant of the archaic era, this statement looked paradoxical, but the Rhodian ruler was a pragmatist. He understood perfectly well that violence only breeds counter-violence, setting off an endless cycle of blood feuds and undermining the foundations of merchant trade. If you want the law to work, you must convince people of its justice, not break their ribs at every opportunity. The second instruction of the sage forbade despising those below. Lindos was a city of sailors, craftsmen, and dockworkers, and Cleobulus openly warned the arrogant aristocracy that if they looked upon the demos as road dirt, then this demos would one day simply burn their magnificent villas along with all their pedigrees. The strength of a ruler and the stability of the elite were measured by his ability to respect the rights of even the poorest citizen. Finally, the third most important sin for Cleobulus was inconstancy and ingratitude. An ungrateful person is the worst kind of business partner. In Cleobulus' political system, loyalty to one word, debt obligations, and past services was the foundation of foundations. A citizen who swears allegiance to the state today and betrays it tomorrow for personal gain destroys the trust in society, without which no serious trading alliance can exist. These 3 simple, everyday rules of Cleobulus were aimed at cultivating character and achieving genuine civic virtue, turning his subjects from an aggressive mob into a united, cohesive, and incredibly successful collective capable of withstanding any external threats. Being a good, kind, and noble person is certainly a very beautiful and honorable calling. But if at the same time you possess the intelligence of a newborn lamb and believe every first swindler you meet on his word, then your kindness turns into a real gift for all the local crooks, who will empty your pockets with great pleasure for the sake of your own moral evolution. In the 6th century before Christ, when Lindos was rapidly turning into the largest trading crossroads of the Mediterranean, hundreds of adventurers from all corners of the civilized world were spinning in its markets and port taverns. Cleobulus almost daily sorted out dozens of lawsuits about fraud and document forgery, thanks to which over the years of his rule he accumulated colossal experience in observing human vices. The result of this psychological analysis was his extremely precise and bitter warning that good people are too easily deceived. The sage from Lindos approached this problem not as a moralist, but as a harsh practitioner and crisis manager of his state. He understood perfectly well that genuine kindness and nobility often go hand in hand with the dangerous illusion that all those around possess exactly the same high standards of honor. A decent citizen judges other people's intentions by his own, and it is precisely this mental trap that makes him an ideal target for professional liars and manipulators. Cleobulus noted that insolent rogues most often disguise their selfish designs precisely under the mask of ostentatious virtue, flattery, and false piety, against which an honest man is completely defenseless. For the merchant elite of Rhodes, such excessive gullibility was not merely a personal flaw, but a direct threat to the financial well-being of their trading houses and the stability of the city markets. Cleobulus, with his instruction, did not at all call on citizens to turn into callous, suspicious villains and misanthropes. His advice was aimed at instilling in good people the obligatory and firm habit of turning on cold critical reason when concluding any transaction or making political decisions. The ruler of Lindos taught that genuine wisdom and virtue must be able to stand up for themselves, armed with skepticism and the concept of the golden mean. Kindness without intelligence and discernment is merely weakness, which encourages parasites and fraudsters to multiply exponentially. With his warning, Cleobulus clearly proved that a good leader must not only encourage nobility in his subjects, but also teach them to recognize other people's lies in time, so that their honest hearts and fat wallets do not become easy prey for the first smooth talker they meet. Mark Twain once remarked that if you gather a dozen professional philosophers in one room and ask them to explain to you the structure of the universe, then after a couple of hours they will become completely confused in their own terms, quarrel over abstract concepts, and leave you in the full conviction that the most useful occupation on this planet is growing ordinary cabbage, since it, at least, is tangible and can be eaten. The inhabitants of ancient Hellas loved to spend years of their lives arguing about what the world consists of, whether it consists of atoms, fire, or boundless chaos. However, Cleobulus had no desire whatsoever to waste precious state time on such nonsense. All his numerous practical pieces of advice and brief instructions were rigidly directed exclusively at the cultivation of character and the achievement of personal, tangible virtue. In his legacy, you will find absolutely no abstract speculations about the metaphysical nature of things. This Rhodian technocrat understood perfectly well that a state engaged in aggressive maritime trade needed not pale youths with a clouded gaze discoursing on the highest good but strong-willed, and cold-blooded citizens capable of taking a hit. Cleobulus' philosophy was a philosophy of common sense and direct action. Instead of inventing complex ethical theories, he issued his subjects with specific daily instructions: how to behave at crowded symposia, why it is dangerous to trust swindlers at the market, and why one should not stage public squabbles with one's own wife. The sage from Lindos viewed human character as a complex engineering object that must be methodically hewn, tempered, and tuned using the concept of the golden mean, removing all unnecessary extremes that interfere with normal life and the commercial success of the city-state. Cleobulus managed to perform the greatest service for ancient thought by lowering philosophy from the lofty Olympic heights right down to the sinful earth, into the very thick of port and market bustle. His utilitarian code of conduct became the best monument to Rhodian pragmatism, turning the dry lessons of the Egyptian priests into working survival rules for future generations of Hellenic gentlemen. When the Greek elite gathered for their luxurious feasts, the main entertainment for them was not vulgar dancing or empty political chatter, but fierce competitions of the mind. Cleobulus of Lindos felt as comfortable as a fish in water in this genre of verbal puzzles, skillfully turning poetry from ordinary entertainment into a sharp razor for the human mind. The most famous and grandiose riddle, unanimously attributed to Cleobulus by ancient authors, was a masterpiece of ancient didactic poetry. The text of this poetic metaphor was laconic, strict, and clothed in impeccable verse form. The sage proclaimed before his astonished listeners the following words, that the Father is one. He has 12 sons. Each of them has twice 30 daughters. Half of these daughters are white, and half are black. They are immortal, but absolutely all of them die. At first glance, this poetic construction seemed to Cleobulus' contemporaries like some kind of mystical revelation or description of a secret cult, for the combination of immortality and inevitable death in one phrase literally exploded the usual logic of the common man. But behind this external mystery hid a cold, mathematically precise calculation of a man who was accustomed to measuring life not by emotions, but by strict astronomical cycles and the pragmatic calendar of mercantile Rhodes. Cleobulus managed to create an ideal intellectual commodity, which instantly spread throughout the Mediterranean, forcing the best people of Hellas to argue for hours until they were hoarse over the meaning of each line. The Lindian tyrant was not merely amusing himself with rhymes. He was creating a universal mental trainer for his subjects, forcing them to seek hidden meaning behind the beautiful facade of sons and daughters. This riddle became the calling card of his poetic legacy. Any great mystery of the world looks incredibly deep, frightening, and incomprehensible exactly until a person with a cold mind and basic knowledge of arithmetic breaks it down into its component parts, after which all mystical revelations inevitably turn into an ordinary and damn logical multiplication table. The riddle of Cleobulus, which forced Hellenic intellectuals to rack their brains at luxurious feasts, had a completely earthly, astronomical, and purely practical solution. This mysterious single father, who governed such a huge and strange family, was the ordinary calendar year. The 12 sons of this mythical father, as anyone not burdened with excessive superstition can easily guess, meant the 12 months into which the Greeks divided the full cycle of the Earth rotation around the sun. The further mathematics of the Lindian ruler was even more utilitarian. The twice 30 daughters of each son mentioned in the verse were none other than the 30 days and 30 nights that made up the standard ancient Greek month. Cleobulus skillfully divided these 30 days into 2 equal halves according to gender and color. The white daughters symbolized the light time of day, that is, the daylight hours, while the black daughters personified the night darkness that inevitably descended on the Rhodian ports after sunset. The most elegant logical paradox in this entire poetic construction was the statement that these daughters are simultaneously immortal and dead. The solution to this contradiction can delight any accountant with its dry precision. Days and nights are immortal as an abstract natural phenomenon, for this grandiose cosmic conveyor belt works without stopping, and the days invariably repeat from one year to the next. However, at the same time, each specific lived day and each specific past night die irrevocably, forever disappearing into the past and yielding their rightful place on the clock to the following days. Cleobulus turned a banal observation of the changing of dates into a true philosophical manifesto about the fluidity of time, proving to his subjects that even the most complex riddles of the universe always have a clear logical basis. A classic once remarked that if a literary work turns out to be truly brilliant and begins to bring solid fame, then it instantly acquires so many authors, critics, and rightful claimants that the original creator of the masterpiece has to spend the rest of his days in court, proving that he did not steal the ink from his own neighbor. In the case of the famous poetic riddle about the 12 sons and their black and white daughters, the situation turned out to be even more confusing, since ancient sources arranged a full-fledged philological discussion around it lasting several centuries. Some authoritative researchers of antiquity, without a shadow of a doubt, attributed the sole authorship of this riddle to the ruler Cleobulus himself, while others, no less respected textual scholars, just as fiercely asserted that the true creator of the verse was his talented daughter Cleobulina. This confusion did not arise out of nowhere, for in the 6th century before Christ, the concept of intellectual property was an extremely vague phenomenon, especially within one family. The Lindian dictator and his daughter Midas worked as a single, coordinated analytical center, where the state wisdom of the father was constantly nourished by the exquisite poetic talent of the daughter. Modern researchers, tired of the endless disputes of ancient biographers, agree on a very logical and compromise hypothesis. The authorship of this puzzle was most likely completely shared. It is quite probable that Cleobulus formulated the dry mathematical idea and calendar structure himself, while Cleobulina, possessing a brilliant sense of rhythm, polished this political manifesto into the impeccable form of the Greek hexameter. For Rhodes itself, this dispute over copyright did not have the slightest practical significance. The family of Cleobulus managed to accomplish the main thing. They created a solid intellectual brand for their dynasty. Whether this poetic riddle sailed through the Mediterranean ports under the name of the father or under the name of his brilliant daughter, the buyers and philosophers in Athens equally understood that on the distant Rhodian rock, there lived people capable of subordinating even the relentless passage of time to harsh logic. This family tandem clearly proved that great ideas have no gender, and true creativity is born where despotic father power does not suppress the child mind, but turns it into his main and most dangerous co-author. If you want to hammer some useful truth or correct law into the heads of your fellow citizens, you should categorically not write long, boring manifestos that no one will read, for it is far wiser to put the right words to a good, catchy tune and have street musicians shout it on every corner during the nearest public festival. Cleobulus of Lindos, in matters of influencing the minds of his subjects, proved himself to be a first-class political strategist of his time. He was not limited to dry judicial verdicts, but was the author of numerous songs, hymns, and poems, which were regularly and massively performed at all official city holidays. According to historical evidence, These works were usually accompanied by the solemn and strict accompaniment of the traditional lyre. The most important feature of this creativity was that the poetry of Cleobulus was exclusively instructive and didactic in nature. His repertoire completely lacked empty, meaningless verses for the banal entertainment of a drunken crowd or sugary odes in honor of his own genius. Every song of the ruler of Rhodes was a carefully constructed lesson in civic defense and morality. Through memorable poetic rhythms, Cleobulus transmitted to the masses his main political ideas, the concept of the golden mean, the harm of excessive alcohol consumption at symposia, the need for respect for the law, and the importance of female education. The sage turned city religious processions and feasts into an effective educational platform, where music served only as a beautiful wrapper for the harsh cultivation of character. The Lindian tyrant applied the most ingenious method of censorship and enlightenment, forcing the Rhodians to voluntarily memorize state instructions by heart while dancing. While in other Greek city-states poets sang of the dubious exploits of capricious gods or fanned the flames of civil war, in Lindos the sounds of the lyre called on citizens to turn on cold reason and engage in self-improvement. The best way to preserve your thoughts for posterity is to publish them in an authoritative anthology, for even if half of your texts are eventually declared blatant plagiarism, and the other half are attributed to some little-known wandering poet, your name will still remain engraved on the cover, forcing academics to argue about your authenticity until the end of time. Cleobulus of Lindos worked actively in the genre of small poetic forms. The most important material evidence of his literary activity is the fact that in the famous Palatine Anthology, a unique Byzantine manuscript collection of Greek poetry, epigrams attributed personally to the Rhodian ruler have been carefully preserved to our days. In those harsh times, the epigram was not at all synonymous with a short, malicious joke, as is commonly believed today. It was a concise, polished poem that was placed on monuments, tombstones, or votive offerings in temples, requiring from the author a colossal concentration of meaning in a few lines of hexameter. Textual disputes around these verses have not subsided for many centuries, since the authorship of some of these epigrams is seriously contested by leading philologists of the world. Some researchers believe that Cleobulus personally composed these texts for the official needs of Lindos, while others are convinced that his talented daughter Cleobulina again had a hand in them, whose elegant pen ancient editors often confused with the monumental style of her great father. For Cleobulus himself, these posthumous philological analyses would have seemed the height of bureaucratic stupidity. For the pragmatic dictator of Rhodes, the epigram was a purely applied tool for immortalizing victories and important laws, and if his texts managed to survive the collapse of the Roman Empire, the fires of the Alexandrian libraries, and reached the Byzantine monks, then they were made of very high-quality literary material. The presence of the Lindian sage on the pages of the Palatine Anthology clearly proves that his intellectual influence extended far beyond the local politics of Rhodes, turning his short poetic manifestos into an integral part of the golden fund of European civilization. Human greed and stupidity are, perhaps, the most durable things on this planet, and that is why the story of a man who managed to turn his own breakfast into pure gold and then nearly died of banal starvation still evokes such lively and sincere admiration in posterity. The Phrygian king Midas, who thanks to his dubious economic talents became a cult figure of ancient myths, was honored after his death with a monumental tomb. A huge contribution of Cleobulus of Lindos to world culture was that ancient authors unanimously attributed to him the authorship of the famous, incredibly pompous epitaph carved on the bronze maiden that crowned this majestic burial. The text of this poetic masterpiece by Cleobulus was a model of impeccable poetic arrogance and monumental grandeur. In these lines, from the mouth of the bronze maiden, it was proclaimed that she would forever sit on the tomb of Midas, announcing to all passers-by of his posthumous glory. The sage from Lindos used grandiose natural metaphors in the epitaph, asserting that this inscription and the monument itself would stand in their place until turbulent rivers flow on this earth, until ancient trees rustle, until the bright sun rises and the pale moon shines. Cleobulus created an ideal poetic manifesto that issued a direct challenge to time itself, turning bronze and granite into eternal symbols of human memory. Cleobulus once again proved himself to be a brilliant public relations man of the ancient world, perfectly understanding that the best way to immortalize his own name was to write verses for the tomb of the richest and most famous man of his century. Even if Phrygia itself has long disappeared from geographical maps, and the gold of Midas has turned to dust, these lines of the Lindian ruler continue to be quoted by great philosophers, including Plato himself. However, Plato in his famous dialogue Phaedrus confidently and categorically attributed these cult lines to Homer himself. This fierce dispute over the true authorship of the Bronze Maiden was incredibly well known and popular already in deep antiquity, turning into a true classic of Hellenic textual dilemmas. It has been observed that if a truly grand and immortal poem appears in the world, literary critics will surely do everything possible to take it away from the real author and attribute it to some recognized national genius who has long been dead and physically cannot appear in court to defend his legal rights. This is exactly the high society detective story that happened with the epitaph on the tomb of the Phrygian king Midas, which the inhabitants of Rhodes proudly considered the intellectual property of their Aesimnetes Cleobulus. For Cleobulus, to find himself in the same row as the creator of the Iliad and the Odyssey was, without a doubt, the highest recognition of his poetic talent. But for the pragmatic Rhodians, this philological conflict took on the character of a fierce struggle for national prestige. Plato and his supporters believed that Cleobulus simply could not physically have written such flawless, monumental, and eternal verses, and therefore attributed them to a wandering blind prophet. In response to these capital attacks, the defenders of the Lindian sage, including authoritative historians of later eras, cited compelling evidence that it was Cleobulus, with his mathematical cast of mind and Egyptian education, who was able to capture in poetry the idea of the eternal passage of time. This dispute split the ancient beau monde into two irreconcilable camps. This centuries-long duel between the admirers of Homer and the supporters of Cleobulus proved only one thing, namely the absolute genius of the text itself. The grandiose epitaph of Cleobulus on the tomb of King Midas, which asserted that the Bronze Maiden would stand in place as long as the sun and moon shone, provoked not only disputes over authorship, but also a stormy reaction from subsequent generations of Hellenic men of letters. The most merciless and cult critic of the Rhodian ruler was the famous poet Simonides of Chios, who not only challenged the scale of the statement of the sage from Lindos, but openly mocked Cleobulus for this assertion, effectively calling him a fool. Simonides approached the criticism of Cleobulus from the position of harsh realism and austere ancient philosophy. He directly pointed out in his verses that hoping for the eternity of stone or metal in the face of the merciless passage of time is the height of human naivety. The poet reasonably noted that even the strongest marble inevitably crumbles and is destroyed under the influence of rains and winds, and the blind natural element is always colossally stronger than any, even the most beautiful human words. In his poetic response, Simonides drew a line under this dispute with a laconic and harsh conclusion, declaring that absolutely everything on this earth yields to the inexorable power of the gods, and therefore attributing eternity to the creation of human hands is unforgivable pride. This grandiose intellectual battle between Simonides and Cleobulus became a classic example of the eternal struggle of human vanity with harsh reality. The Rhodian dictator tried to challenge nature with the power of his genius, while the scene poet coldly reminded him that the laws of physics and time would eventually turn both the tomb of Midas and flourishing Lindos itself into dust. This public criticism by Simonides, carefully preserved by later historians, did not diminish the fame of Cleobulus, but added necessary depth to his image, showing that even recognized sages from the official canonical list of the Seven Sages of Greece were subject to harsh and uncompromising judgment from their colleagues in the literary guild. The entire history of human civilization is a rather amusing and monotonous spectacle, where at one end of the stage mortal gentlemen enthusiastically build monuments for their own immortality, while at the other end, merciless time coldly grinds these granite ambitions into ordinary river sand, leaving from great kingdoms only a reason for another high society dispute. The clash between the Rhodian ruler Cleobulus, who proclaimed the eternity of his epitaph to King Midas, and the poet Simonides of Chios who followed him, who harshly reminded of the inevitable destruction of any marble, quickly went beyond the bounds of an ordinary philological conflict. This dispute, which dragged on for centuries, became a classic, textbook example in ancient culture of the eternal, existential struggle of human pride and deep philosophical humility in the face of inexorable time. In this grandiose intellectual duel, Cleobulus personified the titanic era of archaic rulers who sincerely believed that the strong human mind, armed with flawless logic and fixed in metal or stone, was capable of competing on equal terms with the laws of nature. For the pragmatic Aeschymenes of Lindos, his verses were a continuation of his engineering triumphs, as solid as the stone city aqueduct. Simonides, however, acted as the herald of a new, more mature and skeptical era, which realized that in the face of eternity, any human achievements, whether great laws, impregnable fortresses, or royal tombs, are only temporary and extremely fragile toys, doomed to complete disappearance. In this philosophical duel, both opponents managed to achieve a very paradoxical victory over each other. Simonides turned out to be absolutely right from the point of view of pure physics, for the tomb of Midas indeed did not survive to our days, and the bronze maiden of Cleobulus has long turned into unknown scrap. However, Cleobulus himself won this dispute on a more subtle, mental level. His daring assertion that the verse would stand as long as the sun and moon shone managed to outlive the very bronze of the monument precisely because it was so fiercely criticized and quoted by opponents. And yet, an ordinary cairn of rough stone, piled on the top of a wind-swept cape, has a much greater chance of surviving to the age of steamships and the telegraph than the most elegant laws of metropolitan legislators. In the case of the ruler of Lindos, this pragmatic rule worked flawlessly. On the northernmost tip of the picturesque Bay of Lindos, on a high rocky cape, a monumental stone cairn still stands, which local residents and numerous generations of researchers confidently call the tomb of Cleobulus. From the point of view of strict modern archaeology, the exact burial place of the great Isimnites and Carian athlete remains reliably hidden behind the veil of the past 26 centuries, and no one can say with 100% certainty that it is the ashes of one of the seven sages that rest beneath these monoliths. This round architectural monument itself, according to some experts, may have been rebuilt or erected in a later Hellenistic era. However, for the history of Rhodes, these dry academic disputes have absolutely no significance. For this ancient rotunda like cairn has remained for millennia the most important, integral, and cult part of the cultural landscape of the island of Rhodes. Even after the departure of his soul from his body, Cleobulus managed to occupy the best real estate on the coast, forcing nature itself to work for his posthumous authority. The stone tomb is located in such a way that its flawless silhouette is visible to any ship entering the harbor of Lindos from the stormy Aegean Sea. The human craving for travel to holy and historical places is strong not at all, because people suddenly become imbued with a deep love for ancient philosophy, but rather because every respectable citizen vitally needs to see with his own eyes that specific chair in which a great man sat, and to touch that very stone wall against which he leaned his head when he was tormented by another brilliant thought. In Lindos of the 6th century before Christ, this entrepreneurial streak was developed no worse than in modern New Orleans. The enterprising locals quickly realized that the fame of their deceased ruler Cleobulus was an excellent economic asset capable of bringing a stable income to the city treasury even in peacetime. Alongside the official stone tomb on the Cape, visiting foreigners were proudly shown the famous school or so-called place of learning of Cleobulus, where the sage, according to legend, gathered his numerous students and young daughters for stern intellectual conversations. This location instantly became overgrown with a bunch of chilling details about how exactly the tyrant forced the youth to solve poetic puzzles and practice iron self-control. As a result of such active popularization of the Isimnites' legacy, his tomb and study halls turned into a cult place of regular pilgrimage for thousands of admirers of wisdom from all over the Mediterranean. Educated Romans, arrogant Athenians, and wealthy merchants from Alexandria rushed to Rhodes to undertake what we would today call a full-fledged ancient tour in the footsteps of the Seven Sages of Greece. Lindos became a mandatory and most important point on this prestigious intellectual route, along with Delphi of Solon and Miletus of Thales. Cleobulus, being the greatest pragmatist, would have been absolutely delighted with such posthumous monetization of his name. The man who for 40 years taught his subjects the golden mean and precise calculation managed to turn his own memory into a perpetual motion machine for the tourism industry of Rhodes. Pilgrims did not merely sigh over the stone ruins of his school and lay wreaths on the cairn. They rented housing from local shipowners, bought food at the Lindian markets, and left generous donations in the temple of Athena. Cleobulus clearly demonstrated to the ancient world that true wisdom leaves behind not only scrolls of aphorisms, but also a solid cultural infrastructure capable of feeding your native city for hundreds of years to come. The Roman travelers of the late Republic and Imperial eras, who flooded the provinces of the Mediterranean, treated Rhodes with enormous, reverent awe. In their travel notes, letters, and memoirs, they regularly mentioned Cleobulus and his brilliant daughter Cleobulina not merely as local historical characters, but as a key, fundamental part of the world-famous cultural heritage of Rhodes, mandatory for study by every enlightened nobleman. For the inhabitants of Lindos themselves, this incessant flow of high-ranking Roman tourists with fat purses was an excellent incentive for further improvement of the city. The process of official recognition of the merits of their great Aesymnetes began long before the arrival of the legions, back in the brilliant Hellenistic era, when Rhodes was at the very peak of its maritime and economic power. It was during this period that magnificent marble and bronze statues of Cleobulus began to appear en masse in the squares, near administrative buildings, and in public places of Lindos. The citizens of the city-state sought to materialize the image of their chief legislator, turning him from a semi-mythical character of ancient chronicles into a tangible symbol of national pride and stability. Cleobulus managed to win the main prize in the lottery of historical memory, since his marble effigies served as ideal silent advertising for visiting Roman senators. Some jaded governor, strolling through the Lindian agora and gazing at the majestic statue of the sage, involuntarily felt respect for local laws and trade customs, rightly believing that a people who have monuments to the authors of the concept of the golden mean in their squares are unlikely to stage banal port riots or shortchange Roman merchants on their scales. Cleobulus and his daughter became the best diplomats for Rhodes, who, even centuries after their death, continued to defend the autonomy and cultural prestige of their native island by the force of their authority. However, if you want to gain genuine, ironclad immortality, it is categorically not enough to simply perform a bunch of great deeds, build an impregnable aqueduct, or successfully manage capricious fellow citizens for 40 years, because for this you vitally need to find one meticulous, painstaking, and maniacally devoted biographer who will carefully record every successful phrase of yours, bind it into a beautiful book, and force future generations to memorize your aphorisms by heart. Cleobulus of Lindos, in this regard, drew the most important winning ticket in the historical lottery. His colossal, determining influence on all Hellenic civilization was firmly fixed and preserved for world culture through his unvarying inclusion in the official, sacred canonical list of the Seven Sages of Greece, where his name stood in a row with the greatest titans of ancient thought. However, the key technical architect of the posthumous fame of the Rhodian ruler was the outstanding historian of philosophy Diogenes Laertius, who lived already in the 3rd century after Christ. It was this tireless biographer who performed a titanic archival work, literally bit by bit collecting, cataloging, and transmitting to distant descendants the verbatim aphorisms, laws, letters, and poetic riddles of Cleobulus. Without this monumental work of Diogenes Laertius, titled Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers, the legacy of the Lindian Aesymnetes could well have been scattered into hundreds of distorted oral legends or completely burned in the fires of endless wars, turning into faceless port dust. Cleobulus managed to perform the most elegant trick in the history of ancient public relations, forcing later historians to work for his personal brand. The short, precise maxims recorded by Diogenes Laertius about the golden mean, the importance of education for women, and the harm of public brawling with one spouse survived the fall of the Roman Empire, withstood the religious fanaticism of the Middle Ages, and safely survived to the era of the printing press. Cleobulus clearly demonstrated to humanity that a thought well recorded on parchment has far greater survivability than stone cairns and bronze statues, forever securing for the modest ruler of a small island support the status of an eternal teacher of European civilization. The memory of the ancient Greek sage ultimately officially extended far beyond the planet Earth. The contribution of this man to world culture and science was recorded by astronomers in the most familiar way for them. In his honor, a near-Earth asteroid from the Amur group was officially named, receiving the permanent systematic number 4503 Cleobulus. This celestial body was discovered by scientists at the very end of the 20th century, namely in the year 1989, becoming an eternal monument to the ancient Isimnites in outer space. Interestingly, this object regularly crosses the orbit of Mars, as if reminding us of the ruler military campaigns in Lycia, but never approaches Earth at a dangerous distance, strictly observing that very cosmic moderation that Cleobulus so fiercely preached at his symposia. The Lindian tyrant, with his excellent pragmatic mind, would have found such a posthumous transmigration of the soul extremely amusing and a very profitable affair. While earthly archaeologists fruitlessly argue about the authenticity of his bones in the stone cairn by the Rhodian Bay, a huge block of stone named Cleobulus will surely outlive all earthly empires, new aqueducts, and future global crises. By taking the sage name into orbit, humanity clearly demonstrated that true wisdom and the concept of the golden mean have a truly universal, cosmic scale, turning a modest administrator of an ancient port into a legitimate citizen of the boundless universe. If you leave behind 100 volumes of exquisite poetry, collections of highly wise aphorisms, or pompous manifestos about the common good, then future generations will most likely drag these works into quotations for school textbooks, but will continue to live in mud and suffer from dysentery, while a man who simply took and laid a good, reliable water pipe in his city will have done far more for civilization than all the capital philosophers put together, since clean drinking water is the best medicine for human stupidity and savagery. Cleobulus of Lindos, being a tough and pragmatic technocrat of the archaic era, understood this everyday truth like no other. The most convincing and indisputable proof of his state wisdom was that after his 40-year rule, he left behind not only philosophical aphorisms, but also real, grandiose engineering structures, among which the city water supply was the main jewel. This complex hydraulic system, designed under the personal control of the Lindian Isimnites, was a masterpiece of ancient engineering thought. Cleobulus ordered special underground galleries to be cut into the rock and terracotta pipes to be laid, which uninterruptedly delivered the purest water from mountain springs directly to the overcrowded Acropolis and to the business quarters of the port city. The scale and quality of this work were so extraordinary that this water supply reliably served Lindos for almost 2,000 years, supplying citizens with water right up to the Middle Ages, and individual elements of this ancient structure, according to modern archaeologists, are successfully used by local residents to this day. Cleobulus managed to perform the most practical feat among all the seven sages of Greece. While his colleagues on the list, such as Thales or Solon, wasted precious time on abstract arguments about the structure of the universe or wrote complex laws that their fellow citizens broke the very next day, the ruler of Rhodes simply gave his people clean water. 2,000 years of uninterrupted operation of a public utility is a far more powerful and durable monument to a politician than any flattering odes or bronze statues in the squares. Genuine wisdom is valuable exclusively when it is applied, tangible, and capable of solving real earthly problems. The ruler of Rhodes, Cleobulus, became a textbook example for all subsequent Greek civilization of how a refined philosophical mind can be incredibly effective in everyday practice. He clearly proved to his contemporaries that a sage does not have to be a ridiculous hermit. True intellectual power allows a man to simultaneously manage a bustling port city, coldly lead troops, design complex stone structures, compose poetry, and at the same time remain an exemplary father capable of raising a truly intelligent daughter. This pedagogical triumph concerning Cleobulina was not a random whim of the island dictator. Contrary to popular belief about the total isolation of women in ancient society, the idea of the importance of female enlightenment was actively developed by the greatest minds of that era. The great mathematician Pythagoras paid enormous attention to the education of women, as did the entire famous school he created. The Pythagoreans officially accepted women into their closed union as full-fledged philosophers, rightly believing that the female mind had colossal potential for comprehending the laws of the universe. Cleobulus and Lindos acted in absolute unison with these progressive views, laying the foundations of a new educational tradition. Humanity, over its long history, has managed to invent and safely forget millions of the most complex philosophical systems and multi-volume laws. In the end, all these great libraries inevitably became covered with the dust of ages, giving way to just one short, brilliant, and damn practical phrase. Cleobulus of Lindos forever occupied his unshakable place in world history precisely as the great sage of moderation. This man managed to outpace his time by many centuries, for he, better than all other thinkers on the planet, formulated the simple and fundamental truth that everything in moderation is best. His short maxim about the golden mean easily survived the fall of acropolises, the collapse of empires, and has survived to our days as the main rule of survival for any rational being. Cleobulus remained in the memory of humanity as the architect of common sense, who proved that true greatness lies not in possessing the whole world, but in the ability to stop in time and precisely, subjecting one life to the laws of harmony and reason. Our story about the master of Lindos has come to an end, but the gallery of great minds of antiquity does not close here. If you want to fully immerse yourself in the atmosphere of that amazing era and find out what other secrets the rulers and thinkers of antiquity concealed, we sincerely invite you to listen to the entire thematic playlist of the Seven Sages of Greece on our channel. The link to this intellectual cycle, as usual, awaits you in the description and in the pinned comment. Fall asleep with wisdom, and may your dreams be peaceful.